Hello, everybody. Welcome to the IAB and PwC half-year and Q2 2018 Internet Ad Revenue Report briefing. I'm Sue Hogan, IAB's rather newly appointed SVP of Research and Measurement. I'm excited to introduce this news to our members, the industry at large, and the press. Just a few notes before we begin. IAB and PwC have been tracking digital ad revenue since 1996. Once we conclude at noon, you'll find today's report, as well as every other ad revenue report presented over the last 22 years at iab.com/ad revenue report. So let's start. Today, we're going to be covering the report in three parts. First, a general overview of top-line numbers presented by Christina Serginis, IAB's Research Director. David Silverman, partner at PwC, will then share his uniquely deep understanding of this industry. An assurance partner in PriceWaterhouseCoopers technology and media practice, David co-leads the PwC Emerging Company Services National Practice. David has spent significant time over the past 29 years working with venture-backed emerging growth companies, and chances are you're going to recognize his voice as he's been working with us on this report from its early years. The third part of our webinar includes a pre-recorded presentation that goes beyond the numbers to look at overall digital marketplace. That perspective will be offered by Brian Weiser, CFA and Senior Analyst of Advertising, Media, Internet at Pivotal Research Group, where he's responsible for all ad-focused work. He has held positions as EVP Global Director of Forecasting for Interpublic's Magna Global, CMO for venture-funded Simulmedia, investment banker at Lehman Brothers Media, and entertainment research analyst at Deutsche Bank. Many of you will have heard Brian present IAB's year-end 2017 report. We greatly value his perspective and ask him to return. While unavailable to join us in person, his presentation has been pre-recorded. Questions during this portion of the webinar, still please include in the chat now, will be gathered, and then Brian will respond later in the week. Now on to the highlights and some perspective from our own Christina Serginis. Not to steal too much of her thunder, I have to say I'm pretty excited. The news is pretty darn great. Christina?
Great. Thanks, Sue. Yes, Sue, you're absolutely right. The news is very good. I'm going to walk you through the highlights very quickly, but to give you a brief synopsis, half-year 2018 year-over-year digital ad revenue is now at $49.5 billion. That is a 23% growth from the $40.3 billion that we saw for the first half of 2017. And to put this into perspective, this is nearly $50 billion. And I can remember a time when digital ad revenue for the entire year of 2014 totaled $50 billion. And now here we are, fast forward to the first half of 2018, and the first half of the year is close to $50 billion. And in comparison, Nielsen shows that ad revenue from traditional media increased by only 3% in the first half of 2018. And if you're wondering where this growth is coming from, it's coming from every area, but one key area to point out here is mobile. Mobile advertising has grown 42% to reach $30.9 billion for the first half of 2018. And mobile now comprises 63% of all digital ad revenue. And in comparison, a year ago, mobile accounted for just 54% of digital ad revenue. So it is definitely growing. And if you're asking why this is happening, well, it's because mobile dollars are now following mobile users. This chart using ComScore data, which shows an average monthly usage pattern, shows that most users access the internet from both a mobile device and a desktop computer. And this makes sense if you think about it: work, commute, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of that good stuff. Most people use both devices. So no surprise here that most people are using both devices, with a small number of people using mobile only and a small number of people using desktop only to access the internet. However, most of that time that consumers are spending online is coming from a mobile device. So in other words, 71% of all time spent online in any given month on average is spent on a mobile device, smartphone or tablet, browser or app. And those dollars are now starting to follow those eyeballs. So as we can see in this chart as a summary, Mobile ad revenue is catching up to consumer usage. 71% of time spent online is via mobile, and now 63% of digital ad dollars are for mobile. And one last point that I want to make, speaking of the big picture of digital ad revenue, is that when you look at these comparisons of digital media to traditional media types, digital ad revenue, as I just mentioned, is now at $49.5 billion, and that is a 23% growth for the first half of 2018 as compared to the first half of 2017. Now, if you look at traditional media, if you look at this data, which is provided by Nielsen, we can see that digital outpaces any other traditional media type. Broadcast TV has grown 5% to $26.6 billion, according to Nielsen. Cable TV is up 16% to $14.6 billion. Magazines are down 15% to $5.2 billion. Newspaper ad revenue is down 8% to $3.6 billion, and radio is down 3% to $2.7 billion for the first half of 2018. And now I'm going to walk you through some brief highlights on Q2 and a little bit about pricing trends of CPMs. So Q2 ad revenue is a similar story to the half year of 2018. We see, again, a 23% growth from Q2 2017 to Q2 2018. And in comparison, traditional ad revenues increased only 1%. So Q2 18 revenue is $25.6 billion for the quarter. And now let's look at CPMs, or the price of advertising. These charts are provided by Squad Web Costs. They're not in the overall report provided by PwC, but just to give a little bit of color here, the average CPMs per month for in-stream video ads, or the top blue lines, show that video ad streams overall are up on average 5% year over year. The average CPMs per month for display ads, or the bottom green lines, are down 1% year over year. So video is having a good year. Video is up, which you'll see in a minute, and video CPMs are up. And on this next chart, oops, that's what they're saying, right? Okay. Anyway, on this next chart, looking at the 9-category average of display CPMs and that monthly trend, this just goes to show you, how much CPMs vary over the year for each different category. We see, a couple of seasonal changes, but for the most part, CPMs are flat on display advertising across the year through various, different categories. And now looking more at the formats, as I alluded to before, let's look more closely at the formats that are driving this overall ad revenue growth. So first, all formats have grown since the first half year of 2018. And what we're seeing is that if you look at search, compared to half year of 2017, total search ad revenue is up 19%, $22.8 billion. Search on both mobile and desktop accounts for 46% of total digital ad revenue. And that share is down about 48% of the total for half year of 2017. And that shift in ad revenue is really going to display and video. So display ad revenue is up 27% to $15.7 billion, and now accounts for 32% of all digital ad revenue, and that's up 1 percentage point. Video advertising is up 35% to $7 billion in the first half of 2018, and that accounts for 14% of the total, or up 1 percentage point. And audio is up 31% to $928 million. Audio accounts for about 2% of all digital ad revenue in the first half year of 2018. A little bit more on mobile. Mobile advertising has reached $30.9 billion in the first half year of 2018, and that is 10 times the revenue that mobile advertising brought in 5 years ago in 2013. And looking more closely at mobile's portion of each of these ad formats, we can see the shift to mobile happening. We can see that 59% of search ad dollars in the first half of 2018 came from mobile devices, whereas only 52% of search ad revenue came from mobile in the previous time frame. And we see that 3 out of every $4 spent on display or audio advertising is on mobile. more than half of video ad dollars in the first half of 2018 came from mobile. And again, we see, a lot of growth in mobile across all of the different ad formats. So we see double-digit growth across the board. Mobile search is up 37%, display is up 45%, video up 61%, and mobile audio is up 32%. Interestingly, mobile banner ad revenue at $12 billion is almost caught up with mobile search revenue at nearly $14 billion. So we'll keep an eye on that trend and see if that develops. Social media revenue also continues its upward growth, growing 38% from half year 17 to half year 18. And it is now $13.1 billion for the first half of the year. Video ad revenue on both mobile and desktop has grown substantially. Video ad revenue is up 35% year over year to reach $7 billion for the first half of 2018. This is nearly double what it was just 2 years ago. And that video growth should be no surprise to anybody paying attention to the space. Digital video is now mainstream, with 220 million people streaming video per month on average and viewing 47 billion videos in a typical month. And finally, audio revenue also has grown by double digits. Audio wasn't even a category large enough to measure just a few years ago, and now its half year 2018 revenue is double what it was in half year 2016. Audio ad revenue for the first half was $935 million. That's nearly $1 billion in audio ad revenue for the first half of the year. And that's up 31% for the same time frame a year ago. Of note, audio advertising now includes podcasting. Podcasting is proving to be a viable ad model. And now to summarize, I'm going to hand it over to Sue.
Thanks very much, Christina. I'll let her just recap the highlights pretty quickly. Digital ad revenue, no surprise, continuing to grow. It's nearly $50 billion in the first half of 2018, up 23%. We're seeing all formats in growth, double digit, and we're seeing mobile ad revenue up 42%. That's catching up to consumer usage trends. We're seeing that mobile now accounts for 63% of all digital ad revenue, and that's at $30.9 billion for half year 2018. This closely matches what Christina pointed out a moment ago on consumer usage patterns. At 71% of all online time is spent on a mobile device. Video, we're pretty excited about. That's continuing to grow substantially. It's up 35% to $7 billion for the first half. Mobile video is up 61% to $4.2 billion in the first half. 14% of all digital ad revenue is from digital video now. Social's up 38%. Search continues to grow. It's up 19% to $22.8 billion. Display is up 27% to $15.7 billion. Mobile search and mobile display together are approaching parity at 13.5 and 11.7 billion respectively. Brand continues to rise. When we look at audio, 31, video, 35, and banner ads, 27% growth. These are growing substantially, and we're seeing CPMs up year over year, according to Squad's information, which Christina shared. Those are the highlights. David's going to dig into the details and the drivers for us. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Sue and Christina, and thank you to the IAB. Again, as I've mentioned in the past, we are so honored and pleased to be part of this survey that we've been working with the IAB for the past 25 plus years, and tracking the growth of this industry and as you'll see further in the report, the tremendous impact that it has had on the advertising space. That's what they say. Okay. So we're going to cover the survey scope. Why don't I begin with that and just talk a little bit about how we work with the companies in the space to come up with this estimate. So first of all, excuse me, this survey really starts with obtaining historical data directly from companies generating revenue in the space. That's our first attempt, is to try and have companies opt into our survey and provide the information directly to us. We try and make the survey as inclusive as possible for all types of companies that are selling advertising in the digital space. That includes websites, online services, ad networks, exchanges, and mobile companies as well. And then very important is the fact that we make sure that all of the information is confidential. So anybody that participates in the process is ensured that we have protocols in place to make sure that the information that is provided to us remains completely confidential. The information that we release publicly is always only aggregate information, much to the chagrin of many people that ask us questions about specific companies. We won't provide any individual company information or even small segments of a market if we felt that it was going to provide information about a specific company. The methodology is we start with a database of companies that are selling in this space. We update that database twice a year because the industry is constantly changing. We're constantly looking for new players in the market that might have an impact and make sure that they get included into our survey. We do a mailing survey or an email survey to the leading players within the space, requesting a variety of data from them. We aggregate that information. For companies that do not participate or only provide us with some of the information, we use publicly available information to fill in gaps. And only where it's necessary, we would provide some conservative estimate on any missing pieces. We report our findings twice a year, and this is the half-year report. As Christina pointed out, and as we've been saying for pretty much every year since 2009, the news is extremely positive. 23.1% year-on-year growth to $49.5 billion. This is the 9th straight half year in which there's been double-digit growth. And in 7 of those 9 years, that double-digit growth was in excess of 15%. So we have an industry that has just tremendous growth over a long period of time. When we look at the second quarter, it was similarly 22.9% year-on-year growth to $25.6 billion. And this marks the 33rd consecutive quarter of double-digit growth going back to Q1 of 2010. And similarly, Q1 versus Q1 had 23.2% growth to $23.9 billion. When we pull back and look at this industry growth since inception from 1996, what we really see is a transformative shift in the advertising ecosystem, a shift from traditional advertising to digital advertising. And you can see quite clearly here in 1996 in the first quarter when the industry was only $30 million in total, with a growth of a compounded annual growth rate of 36% annually over the 23-year period. It's now at $25.6 billion for a single quarter. At the height of the bubble in 2000, which you can barely see here as a little bit of a speed bump, it was a $2 billion quarter. So we're more than 10 times the size at the time of the bubble. And in Q2 2018, at $25 billion, the quarter represents more revenue than earned in all of 2009. This transformative shift is really largely as a result of how consumers are accessing content, where they're accessing content, and how marketers are reaching them. A report that has just been released outlines some of the key drivers behind this and how growth has been fueled. Primarily, it's an industry that's continually innovating and keeping up with the latest in technology. First, it was banner advertisements, then search, then rich media. Mobile, of course, has been a significant impact. The use of data throughout this period has improved and has increased to better target the audiences to more efficiently and effectively reach desired consumers. Programmatic has made it easier and more cost-effective to buy. The direct brand economy, which has fueled e-commerce and in return has also fed into the digital advertising space. And lastly, audio, which is I think we're seeing just the beginning of its impact in the market, and we'll see more of that to come. But it's the innovation over time and the constant innovation that's helped fuel and continue to fuel the growth in this industry. Yeah, that's the one that we're on now. So the mix between the first half and the second half of the year, we traditionally see about 45 to 47% of revenues occurring in the first half of the year. That's primarily due to seasonality, with increased revenues in the second half of the year, plus the high growth rate. Based on this historical growth rate, we would expect that the full year revenue would be somewhere between 100+ billion and 110 billion, marking a new record. One of the questions that we get a lot is about concentrations within the industry. And as I mentioned before, because of confidentiality, we really don't talk about any one or two or three particular companies. But we have historically tracked the top 10, the top 25, and the top 50 companies. And what we've noticed in this survey is 76% of all revenues are being generated by the top 10 players. That is at a high end of a range that we've seen in the past. Typically, we've seen the top 10 companies between 67% and between 75 and 76%. So we're at the high end of the range, but it's not outside of what we've seen from a normative standpoint. I would like to point out the composition of the top 10, though, is constantly changing. If we went back 10 years, only 4 of the top 10 companies from 10 years ago would still be within the top 10 now. That's partly due to M&A activity, but also because of innovation in the industry and changes within the underlying technologies and consumer preferences. As Christina pointed out, mobile has had a huge impact. Consumers being able to access content wherever they are, and no better way to see it is the growth in the mobile revenues. 5 years ago, only 14% of revenues were on mobile devices. Now, over 63% of revenues are on mobile devices. Mobile revenue over the past 5 years has grown at a 57% CAGR. Compare that to the industry in general over the past 10 years at 16.1%. Mobile is clearly fueling the growth of the industry as consumers are no longer sitting behind a desktop and consuming the data. Digital video has also had significant growth over time. Video continues to grow, up to $7 billion, representing 14% of all ad spend, up from 13% in the prior year. Search remains the dominant category at 46% of all ad revenues, down slightly from 48% in the prior year, but it does make up the largest slice of revenue at $22.8 billion. And banner advertising at $15.7 billion represents about 32% of the overall market. That's up from 31% in the prior year. Digital video continues to shift from desktop to mobile devices. Last year, we saw it was about 50-50, evenly split. In the current year, we're seeing 4.2 billion of the $7 billion coming on mobile devices, or approximately 60% of the revenues. And when it comes to social media, another key driver of the industry over the last 5 or 6 years, we see tremendous growth at a 48.2% CAGR since 2012. It's now $13.1 billion in the first half of the year. And it represents a little bit more than 26% of all revenues. That is up from 24% in the prior year and 21% in 2016. So you can see how social continues to fuel the growth in the market, outpacing the overall growth, and also a key driver in mobile and video as well. We talked about audio. It's still in its early stages. It represents about 2% of total revenues, but it's outpacing the growth of the industry in general at a 30.6% year-on-year growth. We see great promise in the use of audio with the advent of smart speakers, and as consumers have shifted to mobile, they're beginning to shift to voice. And as they shift to voice, mobile will play an increasingly larger role. And then lastly, we track the pricing models, CPM versus performance versus hybrid. We've seen a slight uptick in the hybrid model going from a little less than 2% to almost 5% in the current year. And CPM also slightly increasing with performance-based pricing coming down. We believe that could be as a result of CPM buys that are replicating performance type buys, but through the use of data and algorithms, the ability to maybe buy it at a cheaper price. And that concludes my findings for today. Thank you.
David, thank you. Again, if you have any questions for David, please add them to the chat box. We will be covering those right after this next presentation. This is the insights of Brian Weiser. Again, Brian worked with us in the last 6 months, and he's going to put these numbers into context for us.
Thanks very much for having me. Happy to talk about some observations I have around the rise of direct brands, specifically as relates to digital advertising and the evolution of the broader advertising industry. Some of you will recall me talking in the past about Dwight Eisenhower and Al Gore being among the two most important people in modern media for obvious reasons. Of course, that being that Dwight Eisenhower is credited often with the creation of the interstate system, Al Gore associated with the creation of the internet. The interstate invention, if you will, is important as an illustration of the change in the advertising economy that really played out over decades, and I think tells us something about how the rise of the internet plays out for a broad range of advertising-related sectors. Prior to the 1950s, the United States comprised a collection of economic regions, many of which had their own dominant brands, their own dominant retailers. With the interstates, it became easier to operate if you're a retailer at a national level, and a manufacturer would more readily follow suit. Advertising budgets would tend to be arranged between manufacturer and retailer in some kind of arrangement whereby the advertiser started to spend at a national level to manage the brand, and the retailer managed all things around directly selling. We could see this play out in other categories, whether it was theatrical, where movies used to launch city by city, and over time they started to roll out across the country all at once. The mobile phone category, which again was a category that was organized city by city, then region by region, then nationally, and it consolidated to a point where you had a small number of nationally oriented providers. The transition to a nationally oriented advertising economy played out over decades, and it played out such that national mass media advertising went from a minority of spending in years prior to 2010 to a solid majority, and probably grew by an extra 0.5% to a solid percent every year of preceding decades. As we mentioned, Al Gore, if he gets credit for inventing the internet, we can argue that it changed the nature of the establishment of small businesses, such that prior to the 1990s, if you're creating a small business, chances are you're organizing around your local market. But it became easier to be a small business and operate at a national, not an international basis with the rise of the internet. And so it's played out over the past few years more pronounced than ever that you can be a small brand and compete nationally and internationally with the biggest brands. So when I've tried to understand this, I've understood this anecdotally, and we've heard from packaged goods marketers that they have been struggling of late. And if we look at packaged goods, just as an example here, we can actually see a real effect start to play out over the last few years. And sure enough, while personal consumption expenditures has generally held up, and spending on fast-moving consumer goods has basically held up, if not increased, we're actually seeing reduction in organic revenue growth from the largest fast-moving consumer goods manufacturer. And so this is all the more pronounced when you start to compare these numbers on a global level, where international markets are holding up much better for the FMCGs, still decelerating. But the reality is here, especially in North America, that we start to see a meaningful deceleration relative to the global numbers. And so we think this is playing out more broadly, not just for FMCGs, but also for apparel and for other categories, where there is a direct consumer model that is taking root. And that plays out when we think about the advertising budget allocation. And it's a really important factor when we think about the overall growth of the advertising economy. Globally, digital advertising is, depending on how you want to define it, the total advertising market, 40 or 45% of the global market. But the total advertising growth rate for the industry around the world hasn't meaningfully changed. You would think that if digital advertising was causing some kind of more meaningful change, that trajectory would have accelerated by now if it was going to, and it really hasn't. And so what instead we see happening is that some of these emerging brands appear to be replacing the more dominant brands, certainly when it comes to advertising. What we can see in this next slide here is just an illustration of some of these direct brands, some very crude assumptions that we made earlier in the year around how big some of them are and how much they might be displacing some of the traditional players. It's probably true that the emerging players are growing by something like 40% or some kind of number like that if you roll up enough of them. And at the same time, it is important to note that many of the larger brands, having now started to invest more heavily in direct brands themselves, are also seeing reasonably strong growth from those emerging categories. But they're now playing in more competitive fields. They're also now having to figure out how to work either with Amazon or Walmart, targeted in different ways, but also how to set up their own direct channels. And that starts to require extra investment in all sorts of other things. And it means they have to develop different competencies. They become very different organizations. And of course, it is really what's leading what we can broadly call business transformation. Now, again, when it plays into advertising, what we are seeing in general is that I think this is contributing meaningfully to the relatively strong pace of growth in digital advertising that we've seen, at least relative to expectations, where the largest brands who are very traditionally oriented and very TV-centric can remain relatively TV-centric when it comes to their allocation of budgets. But because those brands aren't necessarily growing as much, that contributes to deceleration of growth of traditional media, TV in particular. Instead, the larger marketers where they're making allocations that are going to digital advertising are coming, I would argue, largely to support these emerging channels, or at least I think that's where it will happen as years progress. This also then has some lessons when we think about the emergence of direct brands on traditional media like television or digital out of home. It probably is the case that as many of these direct brands, sure, that they will find that the only way to differentiate from, if you're a mattress brand and you're one of 100, how else do you differentiate except for branding? And for that, television and premium video really remains the dominant way to differentiate or establish a brand. But your budget has to be really, really big. So not every direct brand will be able to compete in that space on the long run. But that said, it does support a new source of revenue for some traditional media. The question is whether or not it's enough to replace the money that goes away as time progresses. So overall, it will continue to grow strongly in the long run when we're talking about 2019, 2020, beyond, regardless of what happens during 2018. But it will eventually account for something like 60, 70% of the total advertising economy. At some point, it starts to mature, and digital, online, and offline start to converge more.
Thank you very much. Brian, again, is not able to be here today. We are going to take his questions from the chat box and send them to him directly. He'll be responding in the next couple of days. We do want to thank him publicly for his presentation and remind you that we now have a Q&A that we are going to begin. The press needs to put the word press next to their names, and we're going to prioritize those. Christina, would you field questions to us?
Yeah, scroll back up. So we had a couple of questions. Can you scroll back up? We had a couple of questions about OTT, so I'll just read one of them off, which kind of gets at the point here. Within overall video revenue, what kind of growth occurred across advanced TV? And then there was another question about how are we planning to evolve the ad revenue report? And I'll let David from PwC answer that question.
Sure, thank you. OTT is certainly a hot topic, and we're getting a lot of inquiries around its impact. Right now, it's included in the survey, but we haven't really bifurcated it from overall video. Our intention is that for the full year report, we're going to do a deeper dive into the OTT. So sit tight, and hopefully in about 5 or 6 months' time, we'll have more to share with you on that.
I'll just add to that, and this is Sue speaking, that right after each PwC report, we have what we like to call a postmortem, and we discuss the questions that came up as well as the ideas that we hear bubbling up at our council meetings. That meeting actually is happening next week, and we will be discussing OTT as part of the next, as David just said, iteration. It's not the only thing that we'll be discussing. We have already included podcasts. The numbers have been restated from last year into this new report. Audio we see on the swing. At some point, we'll see a tipping point there where we'll be including audio. I don't think that's going to be an immediate thing. But there will be other areas to delve into. So please feel free to send those through on the chat box, and we'll include them in our meeting next week.
Okay, and there's one more question asking if these are global figures, and I think anybody in this room can answer no, these are US only. This is only for the US market. There are other ad revenue reports that the other IABs do in different countries, and you can find those on our site as well, or just reach out and contact any of us, and we'll direct you to those. But this is only US numbers, so what we've seen today has only been US digital ad revenue numbers.
Christine, I also see a couple of questions up there that are specifically asking about companies. Again, as David said earlier today, we do not dive into any individual company. Everything is aggregated here. We have members who may be very interested in hearing about a certain company or two, but those are also members. We don't do it that way. So this is an aggregated view of the industry. We have a press question. I'm curious about New York City and its role in industry. It's a center of digital marketing, more or less so than in the past. How is its role in the space evolving this year and looking ahead? Hey, David.
Yeah. So I'm happy to give my thoughts on it. Our survey certainly does not do a geographic dive, and we don't look at it from a geographic standpoint. But given that I'm based here in New York City and I'm familiar with many of the companies in the space within New York City, I would say New York does play a huge role. There have been many innovative young companies in the digital ed tech space coming out of the New York City area. So I think New York plays a vital role, will continue to play a vital role.
And on a side note, I just read in today's Metro New York newspaper that both Google and Amazon have opened up new large spaces within New York City. So, that's kind of a vote of confidence towards New York as a continued center for digital advertising.
And the announcement formally of the second headquarters, in New York. So we'll continue to be a positive and a negative as ed tech companies now vie for resources within the market.
So just as a reminder, if anybody has any questions, just type them into the chat box on the right side of your screen, and we'll answer them as they come in.
And I'll reiterate that Laura Goldberg is our press contact for the press. That is laura.goldberg@iab.com. And if you're a member and you have questions, Christine is happy to field those. That is Christina, Kristina, @iab.com. We do have a new question. Have you noticed whether mobile revenue is cannibalizing desktop revenue, or did revenue grow across both channels? In other words, is revenue shifting from desktop to mobile, or is revenue increasing across both in general?
Sure, I'm happy to take that one. So I think of it, yes, you can say it's cannibalizing, right? As consumers are shifting their focus from a desktop screen to a mobile screen, marketers are following that consumer on the mobile screen. So they're advertising on the mobile screen rather than desktop. So desktop is flat. In some cases, it's down slightly, where mobile is getting the bulk of the growth. But I don't think of it as really cannibalization. I think of it as marketers are evolving to just reach the consumer regardless of what device they're on, and the ability to reach them whenever and wherever and however they can, and the best mechanism, best place to reach them. So to me, it's the same ecosystem. It's just a matter of finding them at the right point in the right place.
Thank you. We're seeing a press question too. What portion of audio revenue comes from podcasting?
That is a great question. We'll get back to you on that one. I have that number, but I don't have it readily available.
We'll send that via email.
And there's just one more question here. Can you please repeat the URL for the full report? And it is on the screen that you should be seeing, which is iab.com/ad-revenue-report. And you can find all of the reports going back the 20 plus years that IAB and PwC have been doing this. So again, iab.com/ad-revenue-report. And it looks...
I think we're out of questions. I'm just going to reiterate, we had some great digital news, and we're pretty excited here at the IAB that first half of year, which typically is not as high year over year as second half, really surprised us with a really phenomenal first half and 23% growth. So we're seeing, again, $50 billion in the first half of 2018, up 23%. We're seeing all formats grown in revenue. We're seeing double-digit growth across formats and platforms. We're continue to see mobile grow, up 42%. Finally, kind of catching up with those eyeballs, as Christina mentioned. We're seeing video continuing to grow substantially, and now video being 14% of all digital ad revenue. Social, of course, has grown. Search continues to grow. Display continues to grow. Both mobile search and mobile display together are approaching parity at 13.5 and 11.7 billion, and CPMs are up. So great news, everybody. And on that note, I wish you a very happy Thanksgiving.